Hello, everyone. Charles Coleman here, presenting to you a not so music related review. I'll explain as we go along. This is actually a book review. This is The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 1. It is a graphic novel by Sarah Airriess, which is an adaptation of a book of the same title by Apsley Cherry Garrard. I hope I pronounced both names correctly. It's a book that tells the story of the Terra Nova Expedition. Actually, this is the Volume 1, which represents, I believe, the first half of the whole story. Sarah Airriess is actually doing Volume 2 now, I believe, and I'm looking forward to that one. This is a wonderful book. First of all, what is a graphic novel? It is basically a comic book, but in much larger form. In fact, you may see it's just a huge comic. I mean, it's more than that. There's a lot of innate detail using actual quotes from the book by Garrard. And Garrard was one of the explorers that was involved in the Terra Nova expedition. He was one of about 40 men that helped Robert Falcon Scott, the captain of the Terra Nova, that led to the event in 1912, when 5 men made it to the South Pole and endured terrible tragedy after that. That's a long story we'll get to some other time. But this book tells the story of roughly the first half of that. Again, it's a graphic novel, and it's a wonderful read. The visuals are incredible, and the way Sarah Airriess uses the book by Garrard and is able to cover a lot that is said in word form. She covers it in visual form, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful read. You guys might be wondering, why am I talking about a not-so-musical event on my channel, which is primarily about music-related things? Well, if you know the music of Vaughan Williams, you probably know that he wrote his Symphonia Antarctica, aka Symphony Number 7, which is an adaptation of the film score he wrote for the movie Scott of the Antarctic, with John Mills as Captain Scott. A very powerful and touching film for which has glorious music. Of course, it's Vaughan Williams who writes glorious music, and he adapted that for his Symphonia Antarctica. And I discovered Sarah Airriess by means of a YouTube video here on the John Francis channel, which is it is run by the Vaughan Williams Society, I believe, in which they do lectures on the music of Vaughan Williams, and this subject was that of the Symphonia Antarctica and the music that Vaughan Williams wrote for Scott of the Antarctic, for which Sarah Airriess was a guest speaker, in which she talked about the history of the actual event of the Terra Nova Expedition and Robert Falcon Scott. She did a wonderful job in spelling out what happened in terms of the Terra Nova Expedition. And there's a link in the description that will show this lecture, in which Sarah talks for roughly the first half hour of a wonderful 2-hour segment talking about this subject. Really worth watching the whole thing. And Sarah was just wonderful. Anyway, Sarah Airriess originally was an animator for Disney. She was one of several animators that did a couple of films, notably The Princess and the Frog. And one day she came across a presentation on Radio 4 Network in the UK telling the story of the worst journey in the world, adapted into a radio audio form with actors, telling the story of Apsley Cherry Garrard. And she turned out to be so touched by this event, she left her job at Disney and moved to England to pursue this fascinating story that she wanted to put in this graphic novel form, which is a very, spontaneous and very brave thing to do, given that your average comic book or cartoon is more about superheroes leaping tall buildings in a single bound, aka like that. And she wanted to tell this story, which I discovered, of course, like many others, the story of Robert Falcon Scott and the Terra Nova through the music of Vaughan Williams. And when I heard about this book and discovered her through that symposium, which will be mentioned. I also put in the link The Worst Journey in the World, the radio adaptation on from the Radio 4 network. They're in the description listed below. I was fascinated with the story. It's funny how we both were touched by how these men that were involved in the expedition were so kind to each other regardless of how bad circumstances got, whether it be on the ship dealing with a storm, and then when they got to Antarctica, dealing with the bitter cold weather, which I think will be covered in volume 2 that she's in the middle of writing right now. But nonetheless, it is a really phenomenal story that's worth making it known just for the sake of showing the humanity of these guys regardless of circumstances, a kind of humanity that I think we all can use today all over the world. And so this wonderful book, the visuals are wonderful. You know, if you're into that sort of thing, it is a great book. And there's a lot of annotations or even her annotations are really entertaining and amusing. Very, with your average annotation, it's just a bunch of lists to clarify what's said in Nate's story. But she does in such a very comic. She's a very amusing woman. I believe Sarah's originally from Canada, and then she moved out to the UK. And as I said, worked in Hollywood with Disney, and then left that to do this. The story has always been touching to me, even though we both, Sarah and I, discovered the story through different means, and she goes into a lot of detail in the story, and there's some British terminology that you may or may not know, but the basics are there, and you ultimately figure out. And again, there's some annotations that spell everything out. And I bought this in a store. I did not check it out online. I actually found, I think it was called Midtown Comics in the Times Square area, and I got this copy there. I think it was their only copy. I don't think you can really find this in stores per se, at least in New York. So your best bet is to go online if you have to. I say it's worth it, and I'm eagerly looking forward to seeing part 2. Good stuff. Highly recommended. Let alone the visuals in general about the landscapes and whatnot. She also goes really into detail about how these guys look, how you can distinguish one from the other, like Uncle Bill, I believe he was called, Bill Wilson, who was one of the 5 that made it to the South Pole. Apparently he was a very good sketch artist, and some of actually a couple of the visuals that he sketched out are utilized in this book by Sarah Airriess. Needless to say, looking forward to volume 2. Until next time.